I never thought the hike up to Wolf's Ridge would turn into a nightmare. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, a chance to get away from work and life. My friend, Tom, convinced me to join him. He had been on the trail before and claimed the view from the top was unbeatable. We packed light, just a tent, some food, and the essentials. The plan was to hike up, camp overnight, and head back down the next day. Simple, right? The first few hours were peaceful. The forest was thick, the air cool and crisp. The sound of birds and the rustling of leaves underfoot were the only noises. We didn't see another soul. I figured that was part of the charm. No people, no distractions, just nature. As the sun began to dip behind the trees, Tom started pushing to pick up the pace. "We need to set up camp before it gets dark," he said. His tone wasn't panicked, but there was a certain urgency in his voice that I hadn't heard before. I agreed and we hiked faster. That's when things started to feel off. I noticed it first. A strange stillness in the woods. No wind, no birds. Even the constant hum of insects had stopped. The silence weighed on me, like the forest was holding its breath. I glanced at Tom. He was quiet too, eyes focused straight ahead, but his face was tight, his jaw clenched. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Yeah," he muttered, but I could tell something was bothering him. We pushed on for another hour, but it felt like the trail was stretching longer and longer, like we were walking in circles. The trees all looked the same. When the sun finally set, it got cold fast. We were still miles from the ridge, and Tom was getting more and more agitated. "We'll just set up camp here," I suggested, trying to sound casual, though I was starting to feel uneasy myself. Tom hesitated, then nodded. We pitched the tent in silence, both of us on edge but not saying it out loud. We ate dinner without talking much. I noticed Tom kept glancing around like he was waiting for something. I asked him about it, but he just shrugged it off. When we finally crawled into our sleeping bags, exhaustion hit me hard. I could barely keep my eyes open, but sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside the tent made my heart race. A crack of a branch, the shuffle of leaves. Tom was restless too. I could hear him shifting around, sighing, like he was wide awake. A few hours later, I woke up to the sound of something heavy moving outside. I froze, listening. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. But the steps were slow, deliberate, too quiet for something large, but too heavy to be a small animal. They circled the tent, stopping every few seconds, then starting again. I held my breath, terrified to move. Tom sat up suddenly, his face pale in the dim light. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded. Neither of us said another word. The footsteps stopped, just outside the tent. We waited, the seconds stretching on forever. Then, the tent zipper started to move, slowly, inch by inch. My heart was pounding in my chest. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, my flashlight. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but holding onto it made me feel a little less helpless. Tom motioned for me to be quiet. He reached for his backpack and pulled out a small hunting knife. The zipper stopped halfway down. Whatever was outside was just standing there. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I wanted to scream, run, anything, but I couldn't move. Then, as suddenly as it started, the sound disappeared. The footsteps, the movement, they were gone. We sat there, waiting for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. Finally, Tom unzipped the tent slowly and peered outside. The moonlight cast long shadows, but there was nothing there. No tracks, no sign of anyone or anything. We didn't sleep after that. We packed up as soon as the first hint of daylight broke through the trees. Neither of us spoke the entire way back down the mountain. When we reached the car, Tom finally broke the silence. "I've been up here a dozen times," he said quietly, staring back at the trail. "Never felt like that before, like we were being watched." I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say. All I knew was that I'd never go back to Wolf's Ridge again, and I haven't. I was 2 days into the hike, deep in the forest, following a trail that was supposed to loop back to the start. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows on the narrow path. According to the map, I was only a mile away from the campsite where I planned to spend the night. Just a mile, I could handle that. I'd been hiking alone, which I'd done before, but this time felt different. Maybe it was the isolation. I hadn't seen another person since yesterday, which had seemed like a blessing at first. Now, as the forest grew darker, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The crunch of leaves under my boots was the only sound, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Felt silly, there was no one out here but me. Still, the hair on the back of my neck prickled every time I looked. About half a mile from the campsite, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. There was a footprint on the trail ahead of me. It was fresh. It hadn't been there when I passed this way earlier. It was big too, much bigger than my own. I stared at it for a moment, feeling my chest tighten. Someone had passed through here recently, someone who wasn't me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe another hiker had come through and was already gone. But as I continued walking, I saw more footprints, all heading in the same direction I was. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches whispering in the wind, quickened my pace. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the campsite, a small clearing with a fire pit and a place to set up a tent. The sky had darkened completely, and I hurried to pitch my tent before it got too late. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I had everything set up, it was pitch black. I decided not to start a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I sat inside my tent, eating a granola bar, listening to the sounds of the forest around me. It was too quiet. No crickets, no owls, nothing. Then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching through the underbrush. My heart leapt into my throat. They were close, maybe just beyond the tree line, and they weren't trying to be quiet. I froze, listening as the footsteps circled the campsite. Whoever it was, they were walking around the perimeter just out of sight. I grabbed my flashlight but didn't turn it on. The beam would give away my position. My mind raced with possibilities. A lost hiker? Someone looking for help? Or something worse? The footsteps stopped suddenly, and for a long moment, there was silence. I held my breath, straining to hear. Then, something brushed against the side of my tent. It was subtle, just the faintest touch, but enough to send me into a panic. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The flashlight stayed off. I didn't want whoever was out there to know I was watching. First, I didn't see anything. The trees were dark, their branches swaying in the wind. Then, I caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. It was tall, much taller than me, and moving slowly. I ducked back into the tent, heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. If I stayed here, whoever was out there could come back. If I left, I'd be wandering through the dark, lost. My mind raced with fear, imagining all the worst possibilities. Suddenly, there was another sound, a low, gruff voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close, too close. The footsteps started again, heavier this time, and coming straight toward my tent. I bolted. Without thinking, I grabbed my backpack and stumbled out of the tent, running down the trail. I didn't stop to look back, didn't care if they saw me. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they would burst, but I kept running, driven by pure terror. The footsteps behind me faded, but I didn't stop. Not until I saw the lights of a ranger station up ahead. I stumbled inside, gasping for breath. The ranger looked up, startled. "There's someone out there," I managed to say between breaths. "Someone's following me." He grabbed his radio, calling for backup, and led me to safety. They searched the area, but they didn't find anyone. No footprints, no sign of another person. But I know what I heard. I was deep in the mountains, hiking alone. It was supposed to be a weekend trip, a quick getaway to clear my mind. The trail I had chosen was remote, and not many people hiked it. That was the appeal. I wanted solitude, just me and nature, nothing else. I figured it would be quiet, peaceful even, but I was wrong. The first day was uneventful. I started early, the sun barely over the horizon. The trail was narrow, cutting through dense forest. The trees blocked most of the sunlight, casting long shadows over the path. It was chilly, but I didn't mind. I had plenty of supplies, a map, and my tent for when I needed to set up camp. It was just me and the woods. By midday, I hadn't seen a single person. That didn't bother me at first. It felt like I had the whole mountain to myself. Around the evening, I found a spot to set up camp, a small clearing off the trail. I pitched my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the night. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind or the distant call of some bird. It was almost too quiet. I remember sitting by the fire, eating dinner, when I first got the feeling that something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Maybe I was just jumpy because I was alone in the wilderness. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire, the food, and the peaceful sounds of the forest. But the feeling didn't go away. I scanned the trees, but I couldn't see anything unusual. Everything looked the same, dark shadows and dense undergrowth. Still, the sense of unease lingered. I brushed it off as nerves and crawled into my tent. I woke up around midnight, and the fire had burned out. The forest was completely silent. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing. That's when I heard it. The crunch of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond my camp. I froze, my heart racing. I didn't know if it was an animal or something else, but the steps were too heavy to be anything small. My mind raced through the possibilities. A deer, a bear, maybe even another hiker, but it didn't feel right. The steps were too slow, too purposeful. I listened as the footsteps circled around my tent, stopping every few moments, then starting again. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but something held me back. What if it wasn't an animal? What if it was someone else, someone watching me? The footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure whoever or whatever it was could hear it. I held my breath, waiting. For what felt like hours, there was nothing but silence. I lay there, motionless, afraid to make a sound. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep, still gripped by fear. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent, half expecting to see something. Footprints, broken branches, something that would explain what I'd heard. But there was nothing. Everything looked untouched, like no one had been there at all. I shook off the feeling, packed up my camp, and decided to finish the hike early. I told myself it was just nerves, maybe a trick of my mind from being alone too long. The rest of the hike was uneventful until I reached the trailhead. I was relieved to see my car, parked exactly where I'd left it. I loaded up my gear, ready to head home and put the whole trip behind me. But then, as I unlocked the car, I noticed something. There, on the dusty back window, smeared in the dirt, was a handprint. A single, clear handprint, too big to be mine. My stomach dropped. I hadn't been near the back of the car since I arrived, and I had no idea who could have left it. I stood there, staring at the print, feeling that same sense of being watched. Someone had been there, watching me in the woods, and they'd followed me. I didn't stay to find out who. I got in the car and drove, my hands shaking the whole way home. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched.